First tale. Coyotes are among the creatures about whom you don't hear much. Coyotes are solitary hunters that use lethal accuracy. Before making the kill, they stalk their target for kilometers. Even though they do their best to stay away from people, they will lash out and defend themselves if they are provoked. Coraline learned this information the hard way when she was attacked by 2 coyotes while out for a jog in Nebraska. After her previous pregnancy, Coraline Hopkins, a mother of 2, put a high priority on keeping her health. She thus routinely left the home each day and ran around the countryside. Coraline was just getting ready for a run when she left the home at 8:00 a.m. on July 8, 2007. It was a short walk from her house to the woods, which were on their land, where she began jogging. 10 minutes into a run, Coraline saw movement in the distance amid the bush and thought it was just a dog or a deer, since her objective for the day was 20 minutes each way, which she aimed to raise monthly. She moved more quickly and purposefully created a lot of noise so that whatever it was would know she was there. However, as she went on, she started to feel dizzy, so she had to stop for a bit. On a downed log, she sought solace, sat down, and drank from her water bottle. But as she did so, a tense sensation started to take hold of her. It was easy to distinguish between movement and the wind in the eerily calm woods, and there was a definite sound of crunching leaves that sounded like footfalls and became faster and faster and faster with each passing second. When she turned to look, she noticed that her heart was beating faster. It turned out that the enormous coyote she had seen earlier in the corner of her eye was standing in its tracks and glaring menacingly at her. Although she was aware of the coyotes in the region, she had never really seen one. The animal advanced one more step. Coraline is forced to take a step back, the worst spiting, before it finally began charging at her. That instant seemed like minutes, which made Coraline flee away from the situation. She took deep breaths since her prior recovery was unsuccessful. She was still wearing the metal water bottle around her wrist. She continued sprinting while turning around to see the coyote close behind, but something seemed to be making her blood turn to ice. Then there was another. The second one was rushing at them from a distance, but it had the same deadly purpose as the first one and was also headed in their way. Coyotes are mostly solitary creatures, yet they often unite with one another to accomplish a shared task like hunting. These 2 were Coraline, gaining and of equal size. She attempted to run faster when she saw the silhouette of her home, but her biggest fear came true. She faltered. She faltered. She fell to the ground with her face in the dirt as her foot got snagged on an unorthodox path. The worst agony came later, when she felt the coyote's teeth dig themselves into her left hamstring, piercing the flesh and making Coraline cry with everything. She couldn't see the debris of leaves and twigs were in her eyes, and it hurt dreadfully. The coyote was thrashing about her while attempting to rip pieces of her skin from her. She recalled a large water bottle she had on her right wrist as she screamed and turned her body to the side to strike the beast. Coraline was trying to locate her home when the coyote yelled and fell back. It was visible through the blood and tear stains on her eyes. She just needed to get going. This, despite how easy it seemed to be, was almost hard, since every little movement was accompanied with a scorching agony throughout. Stumbling to stand, forcefully pushing herself to the ground, she then felt agony in her upper arm. The second one was now keeping up. The skin on her arm was peeled off, revealing tendon and bone as it was dragged back. Coraline shouted until her voice broke, then started thrashing around as the coyotes lunged for her limbs. A loud explosion reverberated through the air, causing all 3 of them to shudder, and one of the coyotes collapsed to the ground. The second dog bolted, and Coraline heard the loud pawing on the ground next to her and the growling barking of rage that became softer and quieter as time went on. It was Wilson, a German shepherd who belonged to Corinne. As he rushed up to his wife to assist her in standing up, she overheard her husband's voice as ill as the dog on the coyote. She was unable to do so due to her injuries and the shock of the event. William then grabbed her up and ran her back to the home, where he phoned an ambulance, which was able to show there in approximately 10 minutes. Although they fixed her right away, they had to send her to the hospital for rabies and tetanus tests. Only her flesh was damaged, and it quickly healed. However, she was unable to sprint in the same manner going forward. and her scars pained when the weather changed. Corrine's excursions were more sedate and restricted to the area around her residence. As they got out of the vehicle, they spotted Wilson emerging from the woods with Keith covered in brown fur and coated in blood ever since that day, when the hospital discharged her home on the same day. For what the coyote did to his mother, he got the coyote back. Second tale. The following incident happened in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, when a pack of coyotes attacked a group of campers while they were asleep. In his third year of a bachelor's degree program, Nick Lang was a young law student who was experiencing the stress of final exams. Nick and a handful of his buddies decided they wanted to spend some time in nature and get away from the pressures of everyday life after their last one. They all came from Quebec, and after a few weeks of discussion, they decided on June 23 as the day. Due to problems with boarding, the trip took 4 hours to complete. They ultimately made it to Cape Breton, where they located their lodging next to the well-known hiking and camping path known as Forks Bedding. When the airplane arrived in the late afternoon, they had no place to stay. The night close to the airport and didn't want to waste any time, so they quickly leased a vehicle and drove to the trail. They were all exhausted: Nick, Eddie, Marcus, and Liam, and there were 4 of them. Around 10 o'clock at night, they arrived to their cabin and were prepared for bed up to the cottage bowling. They saw movement close to it, but they didn't give it any thought beyond the fact that it was a deer. They unpacked their belongings before going to bed. The next morning, Nick and Liam were the first to get out of bed and make coffee. They were in excellent spirits, and the morning was brisk, regardless of the early hour. They commented on how enjoyable and happy they were to be in the woods. Soon after, the other 2 guys got up and started talking about what they would do that day. They ultimately made the decision to trek farther into the woods where they could eat and unwind before setting up camp and spending the night beneath the stars. Since the beginning of their first year in college, they had discussed doing something similar, and now that they had packed their belongings, their conversation was about to become a reality. The 4 of them set off on their journey through the forest, stopping now and then to take pictures and enjoy Cape Breton's natural splendor. They finally came upon a nice area with open grass and a glimpse of the distant mountains after many hours of trekking. Liam and Marcus unpacked the tents and began setting them up while they drove pegs into the ground and drew the lines taut. Their bags were set down beside a tree. 4 2-man tents had been erected and were prepared for the night. The remaining time was spent setting up a small bonfire, making some sausages and s'mores, and conversing with each other as the afternoon and evening wore on. They spoke about their time in college and all they experienced. Around 11:30 p.m., Liam put out the fire and doused it with water just in case, then went to sleep in his tent since he was worn out. Each of them entered their tents one at a time and fell asleep. An hour later, in the middle of the night, Nick was startled awake by the sound of shuffling and what sounded like snarling next to his tent. Awakened from his sleep, he saw oddly flickering shadows on the tent flaps, lightened by the dim moonlight. Fear seized him as he became aware of a menacing presence close. He cautiously edged near the tent entrance and carefully unzipped it to the open outdoors. Surprisingly, he saw a critter, which he mistakenly thought was a raccoon, digging through their remaining food near the bags. Marcus came forward as Nicky emerged from the tent and gave his tent a gentle tap. Marcus awoke and said, "What's wrong?" He was recently advised by Nick to go and assist him. Marcus grabbed out his phone and turned on the spotlight, casting light on the bags to show something worse than a raccoon as the couple inched closer. Marcus and Nick saw 6 coyotes looking back at them in the phone's light. A threatening growl. Nick was the first to call out for the other campers to wake up because they were startled, but it was already too late. Nick had already been attacked by 2 coyotes who knocked him to the ground and bit into him anywhere they could. His companions reacted quickly as he shouted and flailed on the ground. In the excitement of the moment, Liam opened the bear spray can they had brought and sprayed it on Nick and the animals. Although it burnt his wounds, they released him and backed away while whimpering. While Liam was taken aback by another coyote biting into his calf, ripping at the muscle and forcing him to fall to the ground while howling in agony, Nick continued to scream as the caps had already settled into his wounds. While Eddie looked about for a stick large enough to do some damage, Marcus continued to shout, trying to scare the animals away while he gave visibility with his spotlight. He saw a good-sized wood next to the fire. As he fled back to the charging beasts, they lifted the structure they had erected from a distance and put it on his shoulder. The log was ancient and heavy, yet he was able to carry it because of his high blood pressure. By then time, the coyotes who were assaulting Nick had left, so Eddie rammed the big log into the one that was latching onto Liam, killing it by breaking its neck. Liam could still hobble despite having a damaged and bleeding calf muscle. Nick was carried to a tent by the other two campers when they saw he was unable to walk. Even though he had ceased yelling, he was still crying constantly. Marcus said the moment will never leave his thoughts as his hands were slick from all of Nick's blood. As they tried to stop the bleeding, which ultimately stopped, they placed him inside the tent while applying gauze from the first aid box to his wounds. The majority of the damage was to flesh, yet they were unable to remain for fear of additional coyotes appearing. Since there was no cell service, Marcus concluded that something had to be done and that someone needed to call for assistance. As he rushed down the trail, he grabbed up the bag of leftover meat and uncooked food and carried it with him, claiming he would find aid. The only other items he was carrying were a backup can of pepper spray and his phone. He threw the sack of food as far as he could while sprinting down the trail in the hopes that whatever was in the woods would go after it and disregard the campers. They waited for Marcus to phone them for hours, but they were unable to take calls. They eventually heard noise in the distance, however, and saw lights peeking over the tree line. They watched with bated breath as Marcus came sprinting back, carrying several rangers who each had a gun. As the dawn was rising, they attended to the Nick right away. Once they were certain he would be well, they carried him along the trail as the others followed. They ultimately came upon a car with other rangers gathered around it, prepared to transport the injured to the hospital. Nick and Liam had left. As a result, whenever Marcus and Eddie felt like it, they would drop by the hospital and see them. They did, and the physician there assured him that they would completely recover and advised him not to worry. Liam's leg fully recovered, and he had no trouble walking. Nick, however, had large scars and nerve damage in his shoulder, which somewhat restricted his range of motion. However, the group made the decision to forgo venturing so far into the woods ever again. They continued attending college, finished their master's degrees, and took additional holidays where they had little risk of coming into contact with animals. Third tale. Our third and last tale is about a young woman named Nicole Clayton, who was out with her dog in Belleville, Kansas, when she encountered more coyotes than she could handle. Nicole was killed as a result. The occurrence happened on April 13, 1974. Nicole made the unusually early decision to walk her dog since it was a warm day. They left their home at 7:00 a.m. and traveled along a road before deviating off the route and staying in the shade while passing through a brief tree line. The stroll would have taken roughly 30 minutes in total. The road was just next to the trail. Nicole wasn't particularly concerned since there were many people on the track and not many incidences involving both humans and animals. Daisy, a mostly Leon Berger that she had been with for 4 years, was her traveling companion. Daisy was a gentle giant that was devoted to her owner wholeheartedly. Their stroll was enjoyable. They went down the road, waving at friends as they passed in their automobiles, having a conversation with a neighbor they had met at some time, and everything was going according to plan. They began to bend further into the woods as they continued to go forward, where visibility was poor, but this was nothing new for them. After 20 minutes, Nicole thought it was a good idea to go back. Nicole turned around as the day warmed up and saw another dog rushing down the path. Since Daisy was prone to anxiety around other dogs, Nicole quickly brought Daisy back. When Nicole sensed something was wrong, they waited to see how the other dog would respond. She really spotted a coyote, not a dog. It growled and sprinted at the two. When Daisy gave it a fierce bark, it veered off back into the trees. Nicole was so terrified that she made the decision they had to return to the road at all costs and make contact with a motorist traveling nearby. Nicole kept an eye on her back as they rushed down the trail, and when the road came into view, she overheard something she would never forget as a sizable pack of coyotes pursued them. There was a sound of trees breaking and leaves crunching, along with yips and barks of violent excitement. They were famished. At that moment, she and Daisy were running, but their pace decreased. One of the coyotes got up to Nicole as she cried out in agony and began to bite at her legs, snagging her ankle. She slowed down a little bit since her leg was bleeding before another of them grabbed hold of her leg and pulled her to the ground. Daisy made a short dash away before turning around to fight off the swarming coyotes. Nicole said that she was unable to recall the exact number of coyotes present, but it was more than 5. Nicole screamed uncontrollably as one of them held onto her arm and tore at the muscle with all of its might. Nicole tried to claw at the ground and escape, but it was ineffective. By that time, the other coyotes had caught up with them and were biting into her in every way they could. While a couple others pursued Daisy in an effort to convince her to back off, one bit into her shoulder. Daisy got more violent as Nicole's screams became louder, catching one of the coyotes and causing the other coyotes to run in terror. The coyote was immediately put out of its misery by the Limburger's teeth, which rotated her face as she ran around and threw it to one side. The person clinging to Nicole, the last coyote, hissed and stood in a menacing manner, but Daisy's barking merely frightened it away since it was louder. They persisted nevertheless, since the majority were still around, racing erratically about and barking as Nicole was a determined fighter and the chance was excellent. She tried to stand up as best she could. She managed to climb the embankment but was only able to limp along on one leg while the coyotes rushed about her, still attempting to bite her legs. She ultimately lay down and continued to scream as the automobile approached. Behind her, Daisy was yelling loudly. The coyotes made a gradual advance with the intention of killing their victim. When the driver saw Nicole, he immediately slammed the brakes and came to a standstill only a few feet away. The coyotes pursued, but the driver of the automobile honked his horn until they fled and disappeared from view. Nicole's wounds were oozing blood as he sprang out of the vehicle and flipped her onto her back. The time to wait for an ambulance was limited, swiftly yet delicately. Daisy, who had followed Nicole to the vehicle, was also in the back seat when he lifted her up and placed her there. As they hurried to the hospital, the guy accelerated down the road, disregarding traffic lights and almost hitting a few parked vehicles. Nicole's condition became progressively worse as they approached the hospital parking area. Screaming for someone to come out and assist them, they came to a stop in front of the hospital. Nurses and staff were waiting outside to carry Nicole inside and respond to her wounds in a matter of seconds. One of the nurses remained behind to interview the guy, who responded swiftly, wanting to know whether she would be okay. The same nurse from earlier came out and told him that she would survive after he had been in the waiting room for more than 2 hours. The next day, the guy left the hospital as Nicole's husband hurriedly inquired about his wife in the waiting area. Nicole could immediately leave the hospital since she was stable. When Daisy watched her owner stumble out of the emergency room, she excitedly yelped in the waiting area. Although the tragedy left Nicole and Daisy with some wounds, neither would have survived without the other. As for her rescuer, Nicole and the guy whose name she later discovered was Albert stayed close friends for years. Nicole made a complete recovery, and for all subsequent outings kept to more metropolitan areas where coyote sightings were less frequent, and where there was always someone nearby.